At my parents' anniversary dinner, they called my 12-year-old the dumb one, handed her cousin the house and the $280,000 trust fund, and then laughed. I stood up smiling and said one sentence that froze every camera. Now they're begging because grandma's paperwork just activated and it's about to explode. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Marisol Carter, and I'm in suburban Maryland, and I'm telling you right now, if you've ever watched a grown adult aim cruelty at a child and call it honesty, you know it hits a different part of your chest because you can swallow a lot when it's just you. But when it's your kid, something in you stands up by itself and says, no, not tonight. My parents' 40th anniversary was supposed to be one of those soft family nights they pretend they want, the kind with cake and speeches and group photos where everybody posts captions about blessings and legacy, and my 12-year-old, Lila, treated it like a mission because she still believed memories can be collected like seashells if you just try hard enough. She got dressed early without me telling her. She fixed her hair twice. She even asked if she could borrow my small ring light for her phone, and I laughed like it was cute, but the truth is it broke me a little because she said, I'm going to record everything for memories, and she said it like she already understood good memories don't just happen in our family. You have to catch them before someone steps on them. We walked into that banquet room in Virginia, and before we even reached our table, I knew what kind of night it was going to be, because the air had that tight, sugary feeling, like everyone had rehearsed their smiles and their compliments, but underneath it there was a hunger for a target, and the target was already chosen. My sister, Paige, was there early with her husband, Cole, and their daughter, Brielle, and Brielle was surrounded like she was a celebrity at a movie premiere. People were taking pictures. Adults were bending down to her level to tell her how brilliant she is. My mother was smoothing her dress like a manager prepping a star. And my father was beaming in that performative way he does when he's about to assign value, like he's handing out trophies. Lila held her phone up anyway, little shoulders squared, and she whispered, Okay, Mom, I'm recording, and I swear the sound of her optimism felt loud in that room. We weren't even seated before my father slid past us and threw the first jab like it was nothing, like it was a min on a pillow. He glanced at Lila's phone and said, Careful, sweetheart, try to keep up. And Lila did that polite laugh kids do when they're trying to be easy, the laugh that says, I'm not a problem, please don't make me one. And I watched her eyes flick to me for half a second to see if I noticed, and I did, and I hated myself for not stopping it right there. Then my mother swooped in wearing pearl earrings and a smile that looked like it had been ironed, kissed Lila's cheek, held her face for just a second too long, and said, There's my little, and she paused, looked Lila up and down like she was checking a stain, and finished with, Helper. Not granddaughter, not sweetheart, helper, like my child was a spare set of hands instead of a human being. Lila's smile twitched, but she kept it on, and I felt that old family rule crawling at my throat again. Don't react, don't ruin the mood, don't make it about you, because in this family the person who gets hurt is expected to be quiet, so the people doing the hurting can keep feeling elegant. Dinner started with the usual noise, silverware, polite laughter, the server pouring wine for the adults, and then I saw the videographer, an actual videographer, moving around the room like a shark with a nice camera, and that's when the pit in my stomach got heavier, because my parents don't hire videographers for love, they hire them for proof, and proof in my family is a weapon. The slideshow started, and the room got quiet the way a church gets quiet when someone is about to be praised, and the first 20 photos were Brielle, trophies, stages, certificates, her smiling with a sash across her chest, her holding a giant check, her at a science fair, her at a piano recital, and the captions were things like, Our genius and future leader. And then finally there was one photo of Lila, and it wasn't her smiling or winning anything or even looking at the camera. It was her mid-sneeze, eyes shut, face scrunched, the kind of photo you delete because you love someone, and the room laughed. Not a full belly laugh, more like a relieved laugh. The laugh people do when they're grateful the humiliation isn't aimed at them. I watched Lila see it, and the saddest part is she didn't look shocked. She looked like she'd expected it, like she'd been waiting for the moment the joke landed, and she lowered her phone a little like she was adjusting the angle, like she could fix how it felt by changing the framing. If you've ever watched a child try to edit reality with a tiny motion, you know what I mean? It's like watching someone try to hold back rain with an umbrella full of holes. My father took the microphone and did the whole speech about 40 years, sacrifice, family, blessings, and he smiled like he was about to do something generous, the kind of smile that makes people clap before they even know why. And then he said, "Tonight we're celebrating the future of this family." And my sister Paige's hand landed on Brielle's shoulder, like she was pinning a medal. My mother stepped in smoothly, taking the mic like she'd been waiting for it all night, and she said, bright and camera ready, "And we've made a decision about legacy." And that word legacy is the one they use when they want to sound noble while they're being vicious. My father said it loud and clear. Brielle will inherit the house. And people applauded like inheritance is an award you earn for being favored. And then my mother nodded toward Brielle and said, "And the family trust, $280,000. That goes to Brielle too? All of it." And there was a cheer, a literal cheer. And then she added, like she was reading a line from a script she'd practiced in the mirror, "Lila is not included." That last sentence didn't land like a sentence. It landed like a gavel. Lila's phone stayed up for 1 second longer, like her body was waiting for someone to laugh and say, "Just kidding," or for someone to say her name, to correct it, to soften it, and no one did. She lowered the phone, and the camera caught the tablecloth. Not slowly, not politely. It dropped like her hands gave out. My father leaned toward a guest near the front and chuckled just loud enough to carry. "You know how it is. One's the genius and the other one's the dumb one." And people laughed again, not everyone, but enough, and that's what will haunt me forever, because enough is how cruelty survives. Lila went perfectly still, and I could see her doing that thing kids do when they're trying to disappear without moving, like if she becomes invisible the pain won't find her, and she stared at the table like it was safer than any face in the room. My mind did this strange split where half of me wanted to stand up and scream, and the other half heard my mother's voice from every holiday I ever survived saying, "Don't embarrass us." And then I felt something deeper than anger, something cold and clear, like my body decided we weren't doing fear tonight. Before I go further, I need you to do something for me because I want to know who I'm talking to and I want you to feel less alone in this. Where are you watching from right now? What city and what time is it there? Because I swear this kind of family behavior hides in every zip code, and I want to see the map of people who understand exactly what I mean. Okay, back to that room, because this is the moment everything changed. I didn't cry, I didn't gasp, I didn't collapse. I stood up slowly and I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because a smile is a mask that buys you 2 seconds of control, and control is everything when someone just tried to turn your child into a punchline. I remember feeling the fabric of my dress tight across my knees as I pushed my chair back. I remember the scrape of the chair legs on the floor sounding louder than the music. I remember Paige's eyes flicking up like she'd just realized the target might move. I remember Cole's hand going to Paige's elbow, like he was managing a public relations crisis. And I remember my mother's grip tightening on her champagne flute, so hard I thought it might crack. Lila finally looked up at me, and her eyes were wet but refusing to spill. And in that second I saw the question behind her face. The one she didn't dare say out loud in front of everybody. Am I really the dumb one? And I hated my parents for putting that question in her head, and I hated every adult in that room who heard it and stayed comfortable. My father's eyes narrowed at me the way they always do when I step out of the role he assigned me, and he said low, through his smile, "Sit down. Not what's wrong. Not is she okay. Just control." My mother did that bright fake laugh and said, "Honey, don't be confused. We're just celebrating." And Paige added quickly, too quickly, "Don't make this about you." Like erasing my child was somehow not already about me. I reached into my bag and felt the edge of the folder. The one I'd brought even though I promised myself I wouldn't need it. The one that still smelled faintly like paper and the leather of the attorney's briefcase from the night he came to my kitchen after Grandma Elena died. I didn't pull it out yet. I just let my fingers touch it, because sometimes the difference between breaking and holding steady is knowing you're not empty-handed. I looked around the room at all the raised phones, the videographer panning like he could smell drama, and I realized my parents had chosen their battlefield, microphones and cameras and an audience, because they thought public humiliation would make me shrink, and they thought a child couldn't fight back. And they thought I would do what I always did, swallow it, smile, disappear. I leaned slightly toward the table, not to beg, but to anchor my voice so it didn't shake, and I said, clearly enough for the microphones and the phones and the people in the back pretending not to watch. Just so everyone's clear, my daughter is already named as a beneficiary. The room didn't stop all at once. It stalled in pieces like a song skipping. Claps died midair. A laugh got stuck in someone's throat. The videographer snapped toward me like his instincts kicked in, and my parents' faces changed so fast it was almost funny, because you could see the exact moment they realized the script wasn't going to go the way they planned. My father blinked slow. My mother's smile froze in place. Paige's jaw tightened, and Lila's head turned toward me like she wasn't sure she heard me right. My father took one step forward, and for the first time all night his voice wasn't playful. It was sharp, and he said, "What did you just say?" And I kept smiling because a smile at that moment isn't politeness. It's a warning, and I said what I said, and I could feel the whole room leaning in, not out of concern, but out of curiosity, because people love a family collapse as long as it's not theirs. And my mother's eyes flashed with something ugly and terrified, because she knew exactly which folder I meant even before I lifted it, and she knew why Grandma Elena designed it the way she did, and she knew I didn't have to shout to make the floor fall out from under them. I just had to let them hear the paperwork breathe. My mother's face did this tiny twitch she always does when she's about to lie with confidence, and my father's eyes darted to the phones in the room like he suddenly remembered evidence exists, and my sister Paige's posture stiffened like she could physically block the truth from reaching the audience. And my niece Brielle looked confused because she's a kid, and kids can feel when adults are playing a dirty game even if they don't have the language for it. And my daughter Lila was staring at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language, and she desperately wanted to believe it meant she wasn't disposable. My father leaned closer, voice low, meant to intimidate without making a scene. "Marisol, sit down, you're embarrassing us." And I remember thinking, wow, isn't that convenient? Because when they embarrassed a child into a microphone, it was legacy. But when I corrected them, it was embarrassment. I kept my smile, and I kept my tone calm, because the second you get emotional, people stop hearing your facts and start judging your attitude. And I said, "I'm not embarrassing anyone. I'm clarifying." And then I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, not with a flourish, not dramatic, just steady, like pulling out a permission slip that should have been signed years ago. And the paper inside was thick and official, the kind of paper that doesn't care how loud someone's last name is. The videographer moved closer. I saw it out of the corner of my eye, a small shift, a predator scenting blood, and I almost laughed because of course, they want to record drama. But the difference is this time the recording would protect my child instead of humiliating her. My mother laughed sharply, the way she does when she's trying to turn panic into a joke. "Oh my goodness, look at you, always with your little paperwork." And she tried to take the folder from my hands like she could snatch the moment away, and I stepped back without even thinking, not scared, protective, the same reflex you have when someone reaches for your kid too fast. Paige spoke fast and loud, trying to control the room. "This is inappropriate. It's their anniversary. Stop making it about your issues." And there was again that magic trick they do. They harm someone and then they accuse the wounded person of being disruptive for noticing. I looked at Paige and then at her daughter, and I said, "Paige, you're smiling while they erase Lila. If you can watch that and call it inappropriate when I respond, you're not confused. You're complicit." And a few people shifted in their seats because nothing makes an audience uncomfortable like being reminded they're part of the scene. My father lifted his chin and went for authority. "Where did you get that?" Like the folder was contraband, and I said, "From Grandma Elena's attorney." And my mother's champagne flute actually trembled in her hand. A tiny shake she tried to hide by taking a sip. And I noticed because when you've grown up in a family like this, you become a body language detective. Lila's eyes flicked from my face to the folder and back, and she whispered, barely audible, "Mom?" And I angled my body slightly, so she could see me without staring through a wall of adults, and I nodded at her, a small nod that said, "I'm here, you're safe, you're not alone." My father tried to seize control again. "We are the trustees," he said, loud enough for the front tables to hear, and that's when I felt the room tilt, because I knew the one word that would split his confidence clean in half. "You were," I said, and I watched it hit him like a slap, because trusteeship isn't a vibe, it's a legal role, and he knew Grandma Elena had the power to change it. My mother's smile widened too hard, the way people smile when they're trying to keep their face from cracking, and she said, "Honey, you must be mistaken. We didn't say Lila gets nothing. We were speaking generally." And I looked around at the raised phones, at the videographer, at the microphone still sitting on the stand like a loaded weapon, and I said, "Do you want to say that into the microphone too? Because you already said Lila is not included into a microphone." Someone near the back made a small sound, like a cough that was really a laugh trying not to be rude, and my mother's eyes flashed at that person like, "How dare you not stay on script?" My father's jaw worked as he searched for a new angle, and he went for the oldest one in the book. "You're twisting our words. You always do this." And I said, "No, I'm repeating your words. Twisting would require imagination. I don't need imagination. I have audio." Paige cut in. "You're doing this because you're jealous. You've always been jealous of me." And it was almost funny, because she said it like jealousy is the only reason a mother would protect her child. I kept my eyes on my parents because Paige wasn't the power source, she was the echo, and I said, "This isn't about you, Paige. This is about my daughter being called the dumb one by grown adults who should be protecting her." And right on cue, my mother snapped, "We never called her dumb." And I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just pointed my chin toward my father's table where he'd laughed into the air, and I said, "He did. 5 minutes ago. Out loud. With witnesses." And half the room laughed. And that last part was for the guests, not for my parents, because adults hate being reminded of their laughter when it wasn't kind. I saw a woman's face tighten with shame. I saw a man glance down at his plate. I saw someone's husband whisper, "Stop recording." And that's when I realized the room wasn't just watching anymore. It was choosing sides, silently. The way people do when they don't want to admit they're choosing. My father reached for the folder again, palm out like a judge demanding evidence, and I stepped back again and said, "Don't touch it." Not angry, just final. And my father froze because he wasn't used to being told no in public. My mother tried a softer tone, the fake warmth. "Marisol, darling, let's talk privately." And I turned my head slightly, like I was considering it, and then I said, "You had your chance to do private. You chose a microphone. You chose cameras. You chose an audience. So, we're doing it right here where you wanted it." Lila's chair scraped softly as she shifted, and I could see her shoulders rising like she was bracing for impact, and I hated that she even had to brace. So I kept going because clarity can be a shield for a child. I held the folder up, not opening it fully yet, just enough so the nearest people could see the top line and the signature block, and I said, "This is an amendment to Grandma Elena's trust, signed before she passed, witnessed, notarized, filed. The kind of document that doesn't care who's loudest at a dinner table. My father went pale in a way that wasn't dramatic. It was physical, like the blood left his face to go do math somewhere else, and he said, "That trust belongs to us." And I corrected him like I was correcting a child's homework. "No, the trust belongs to the beneficiaries. You were allowed to manage it." You confuse permission with ownership. Paige's husband Cole finally spoke, trying to sound like the reasonable man. "Let's calm down, this is family." And I looked at him and said, "Family is not a license to bully a child. Family is supposed to be the first place a child is safe." And that hit harder than yelling, because nobody wants to look like the guy defending public cruelty to a 12-year-old. My mother's eyes went wet, not real tears, performance tears, the kind she uses when she's losing control and needs sympathy, and she said, "You're ruining our anniversary." And I said, "You ruined Lila's childhood in public. I'm just refusing to participate." And then I did the one thing they weren't prepared for. I turned away from them and looked directly at the room, at the guests, at the phones, and I said, "I'm going to keep this simple because my daughter is right here, and she doesn't need a courtroom. Tonight you heard my parents announce that my niece inherits the house and the $280,000 trust, and that my daughter is not included." That statement triggered the clause in Grandma Elena's amendment, which means starting now, they no longer control the trust the way they've been pretending they do. My father barked, "That's not how it works." But his voice cracked on the last word because he knew it might be exactly how it works. My mother tried to laugh again, but it came out thin. "Clause? What clause?" And I said, "The one Grandma Elena wrote for this exact moment, because she knew you were careful. She knew you'd hurt people softly enough to deny it later. So she designed something that only activates when you do it on record." And I glanced at the videographer, and then at the phones, and then back at my parents, and I added, "Congratulations. You documented it." And that's when something small but powerful happened. My daughter Lila, still shaky, still wounded, lifted her eyes off the tablecloth and looked around the room like she was realizing she existed in it again, like she didn't have to disappear to survive. And I wanted to cry at that, but I didn't, because we were not giving my parents the satisfaction of seeing me break. My father leaned in and hissed, "You're going to regret this." And I leaned in just enough so he could hear me without anyone else catching it, and I said, "You tried to corner my kid with a microphone. I regret not stopping you sooner. That's the only regret I'm carrying." And then I turned back to Lila, held my hand out, palm open, and she took it instantly like she'd been waiting all night for someone to choose her out loud. And I said, "We're leaving," and Paige snapped, "If you walk out, you're done." And I looked at her and said, "I've been done in this family my whole life. I'm just finally acting like it." And we started walking, not running, walking, because walking says we're not ashamed. Behind us, I heard my mother's voice climb into panic. Stop her, like she was talking about a thief, not her own daughter. And I heard my father bark, "Get that folder." And I felt Lila's grip tighten like a vice. And that's when I realized they weren't just angry, they were scared, because anger is loud, but fear makes people reckless. And the second we hit the hallway outside the banquet room, my phone started vibrating in my bag like it was possessed, and I already knew what was coming next, because my parents don't handle consequences quietly. They escalate, they threaten, they rewrite, they punish. And the worst part is they always aim for the softest place to hit you. And as I reached for my keys with one hand and held my daughter with the other, I saw the notification banner flash across my screen, and my stomach dropped because it wasn't just my parents calling, it was Lila's school number. And in that exact moment, I knew they weren't done trying to control the story. They were about to try to control my child. The moment I saw Lila's school number flash across my screen, my body did that cold drop thing where your stomach falls first and your brain catches up second. And I didn't even answer like a normal person. I swiped so fast I almost threw the phone, and I said, "This is Marisol, what's going on?" And the receptionist on the other end had that bright, cheerful voice people use when they have no idea they're holding a match near gasoline. Hi. We just wanted to confirm your daughter's grandparents are here to pick her up. And for half a second, I didn't hear anything else. It was like the world got muffled, like someone pressed a pillow over my ears. And then I heard myself say, very slowly, very clearly, do not release her. And the receptionist paused, confused. They said it's an emergency. And I felt my jaw tighten so hard it hurt because of course they did. Of course, the second they lost control, at dinner they ran to the next place that still had a loose lock, and I said, it's not an emergency. It's manipulation. I'm on my way. Do not let my child leave the building with anyone but me. And I didn't wait for confirmation because I know how this works. People like my parents count on politeness. They count on rules being followed by everyone except them. They count on the fact that a school office will treat grandparents like harmless Hallmark characters, and then they use that access like a crowbar. I grabbed Lila's hand. I didn't even ask if she was okay because her face was already answering that question, eyes wide, breathing shallow, like she could sense something coming even if she couldn't name it. And I said, we're going to your school right now. And she whispered, did I do something wrong? And that almost broke me because that's what they did to her. They trained her to think adults' cruelty must be her fault. And I said, no, honey, you did nothing wrong. This is grown-ups making ugly choices. And then I moved keys, purse, phone like my body was running a checklist. In the car, the steering wheel felt slick under my palms because my hands were sweating, and I drove like I had a rope tied between my chest and that school building, like every red light was personally insulting me, and Lila sat rigid, staring out the window, and she asked so small, are they mad at me? And I said, they're mad they got caught. And she swallowed and asked, are we still safe? And I wanted to say yes like it was a guarantee, like I could wrap the word around her like a blanket. But safety is something you build with actions, not promises, so I said, we are getting safe.
Right now.
Watch me. When I pulled into the school parking lot, I didn't even find a normal space. I stopped like I was dropping off an organ for surgery, and we walked fast, not running because running makes a child feel like a chase, but fast enough that my pulse was beating in my throat. The front office smelled like disinfectant and crayons, that warm school smell that usually makes me feel calm, and today it made me furious because it's supposed to be a safe place, and my parents were trying to poison it. And there they were. My mother standing by the counter with that bright smile she uses on strangers, the smile that says, look how kind I am. I'm the kind of woman who bakes casseroles, and my father beside her, stiff, jaw tight, eyes scanning like he was looking for the nearest lever to pull. The receptionist looked relieved when she saw me. Like, thank God the actual parent is here. And my mother turned and said, there you are, sweetheart. Like we hadn't just left a dinner where she helped erase my child, and my father cut in. We're taking her. No hello, no warmth, just a claim. I walked straight to the counter and said, remove them. And the receptionist blinked. I'm sorry, and I repeated, remove them from her pickup list.
Right now.
And mark it in her file that no one but me is allowed to take her. Not grandparents. Not aunt. Not family. Only me. And my mother's smile cracked at the edges. Marisol, don't be dramatic. And my father leaned forward, voice low, meant to scare the receptionist into compliance. We are her grandparents. And I turned my head and looked at him, and I said, calm. You are adults who just tried to corner a child at school after humiliating her in public. Leave. And my father's face tightened. Excuse me. And I said, leave. Again, same tone, because I learned a long time ago that raising your voice gives them a ladder to climb onto. It gives them a way to call you unstable, and I wasn't giving them that. My mother tried to pivot to the receptionist. We're not dangerous. And I stared at her and said, you already hurt her. And the receptionist's eyes widened because people like my parents rely on private harm. They rely on nobody saying the quiet part out loud in public spaces. The receptionist began typing with shaking fingers, and my father saw controls slipping and tried to claw it back. We came because we care. And I laughed once, a small sound that surprised even me because it was so dry, and I said, "If you cared, you would have defended her at dinner instead of laughing along." And my mother snapped, "We never laughed." And I didn't argue, I simply said, "There were cameras." And that shut her up because cameras are the one relative they can't bully into. Silence. Lila stood slightly behind me, and I could feel her trembling through her hand, and I lowered my voice and said, "Stay right here." And she nodded, eyes locked on my mother like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to look away. My mother took a step toward Lila, hand out like she was going to touch her cheek, and something feral rose in me. Not anger, not hatred, just pure protective instinct, and I moved one step to block her without even thinking, and I said, "Do not touch her." And my mother's eyes flashed with the outrage of being denied access to a child she believes she owns emotionally, and she hissed, "You can't keep her from us." And I said, "Watch me." Right then, the school security officer, a calm older man who had probably seen every flavor of family drama, stepped closer because my father's posture was escalating, and my father noticed the attention and swallowed his rage like he always does when there are consequences, and he said, too loudly, "Fine, we'll handle this another way." And my mother grabbed his arm, still smiling at the receptionist like she wanted to leave as the sweet grandma who just got misunderstood, and they walked out. When the glass door shut behind them, the air in the office felt lighter, but my chest still felt tight, and I crouched in front of Lila so we were eye level, and I smoothed her hair back, and I said, "You are not in trouble." And she whispered, "They said it was an emergency." And I said, "Their emergency is losing control." And she blinked hard like she was trying not to cry, and I told her, "You never apologize for adults making bad choices," because she opened her mouth and the word "sorry" was already trying to escape, and I wasn't letting that seed grow in her. The receptionist handed me a printed sheet to sign confirming the change, and I signed so firmly my pen almost tore the paper, and then I asked for the principal's email, and I asked for the counselor's name, and I asked for the school's policy on unauthorized pickup attempts, and the receptionist looked startled by the speed of my questions. But I wasn't being dramatic, I was being confident, because this is how you protect a child when other adults won't. And right here, let me ask you something, because I know a lot of you watching are grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, and you've seen families play power games like this. So tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now, because I want to know how far this kind of mess reaches. And I want to know if you've ever had to step between a child and a family member who didn't deserve access. We got back in the car, and Lila sat there quiet, eyes glassy, and she asked the question that always shows you what a child actually heard. Are they going to take me? And I felt my throat tighten again, but I kept my voice steady and I said, "No, they will not surprise you again." And she whispered, "But they tried." And I nodded. They did. And now they can't. When we got home, I did something I should have done years ago. I made receipts, not because I'm petty, because I'm a mother, and mothers who've been underestimated learn to document everything. I saved the voicemail for my father, because while I was in the school office, my phone had already collected a few, and his voice in the first one was calm in that dangerous way. "Marisol, stop whatever you think you're doing." And then the second one was sharper. "If you don't fix this, you'll regret it." And I saved both. I pulled up the anniversary video, the clip where the microphone caught my mother saying the trust and house go to Betrayal, and Lila is not included. And I watched it again, not because I enjoy pain, but because I needed to see it the way a third party would see it, clean, undeniable. And I emailed it to Mr. Caldwell with one line. They did it on record. Then I made Lila hot chocolate, because sometimes protection looks like paperwork and sometimes it looks like marshmallows, and she asked, stirring slowly, "What does beneficiary mean?" And I said, "It means someone set something aside for you on purpose." And she stared into the mug and whispered, even if they don't like me. And I knelt beside her and said, even if they don't understand you, even if they're cruel, you're still worthy. And Grandma Elena understood, and she nodded like she wanted to believe me, but wasn't sure belief was allowed. At 6:12 the next morning, my email pinged, and I swear my whole body woke up before my eyes did, and the subject line was so plain it was scary. Confirmation of notice receipt. And when I opened it, the message was short, professional, cold in the way legal systems are cold, and the sentence in the middle made my hands start shaking. The triggering event occurred on record. Administrative steps will begin today. And I sat there staring at those words because administrative steps sounds boring until you realize it means somebody with authority is about to walk into your parents' little kingdom and start flipping switches they can't reach. And right then, like clockwork, my phone started ringing again, and it wasn't just my father this time. It was Paige, it was Cole, it was Aunt Renee. It was people who laughed at the table now, suddenly acting like they cared about family unity. And I let it ring because I've learned something hard and true. The loudest people about respect are usually the least respectful. But then a new notification popped up and my stomach tightened all over again because it was a message request from someone I didn't expect, and it included a screenshot of the anniversary video already being shared with captions, zoom-ins, and comments, which meant the evidence wasn't just in my hands anymore, it was in everybody's hands. And if you know families like mine, you know what that means next. Because the moment humiliation spreads, they stop trying to fix the truth and start trying to destroy the person holding it. The next 48 hours felt like living inside a group chat fire, because once that anniversary clip left the room, it didn't travel, it multiplied, and it didn't matter that I never posted it, because families like mine don't need your permission to weaponize your pain. They just need a forward button and an audience that likes mess. And by noon the next day, my cousin Tasha was texting, "Is this real?" And my uncle's wife was calling my job asking to check on me, which is code for, I want the gossip firsthand. And then my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Renee that made my blood run cold. Not because she was concerned, but because she was excited, and she wrote, "Girl, the video is everywhere." And then she sent me a screen recording where someone had added captions in giant white letters, zoomed in on my mother's face when she said, "Lila is not included," and then slowed it down like a sports replay. Like my child's humiliation was a touchdown. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that clip, hearing the applause in the background, and I felt something shift in me, not sadness, not even anger, more like clarity, the kind that arrives when you realize there is no version of this where these people suddenly grow a conscience. Because if a room full of relatives can clap while a child gets erased, the problem isn't one sentence, it's a culture, and cultures don't apologize. They retaliate. And retaliate they did. My father called again at 1:07 p.m., and when I didn't answer, he left a voicemail that sounded like he was reading a script for Concerned Patriarch. "Marisol, we need to talk privately, this is getting out of hand." And then, right on schedule, the tone shifted. "You're embarrassing your mother. You're embarrassing this family." And I remember thinking, wow, not one word about Lila's face when they called her the dumb one. Not one word about the microphone, just brand management, just optics. Because to him, our lives are a stage, and he's the director. Then my mother texted something that would have been funny if it wasn't so sick. "Sweetheart, we were celebrating. You know how your father jokes." And I stared at that word sweetheart like it was a spider, because she only uses tenderness as a tool, and I typed back one line, "Jokes don't require microphones." And she replied immediately, "You're twisting things." And that's when I stopped replying, because arguing with gaslighting is like trying to mop up a flood with a napkin. You'll just exhaust yourself and still be wet. Meanwhile, Lila came home from school quiet and tight, like she was holding her breath in her own house. And when I asked how her day was, she said, "Fine." But her eyes wouldn't meet mine, and later, while I was making dinner, she stood in the doorway and asked, "Mom, are people going to think I'm stupid?" And I felt my heart crack in that specific way it cracks when your child starts carrying a label that was never hers. And I put the spoon down, turned the stove off, and I said, "Come here." And I sat her at the table and took her hands, and I said, "Listen to me. Reading hard doesn't mean you're dumb. It means your brain takes a different route, and different routes still get you there." And she whispered, "But Grandma and Grandpa said it." And I didn't sugarcoat it. I said, "They were wrong and they were cruel, and adults can be wrong and cruel, even when they're family." And she looked like she wanted to cry but didn't know if she was allowed, so I told her, "You are allowed to feel hurt, and you are allowed to be angry, and you are allowed to not like people who hurt you. Because kids like Lila get taught to forgive before they're even allowed to name the harm." And I wasn't letting that happen. That night, after she fell asleep, I did the unglamorous work that changes outcomes. I logged into the school portal again. I removed every single emergency contact except me. I updated the pickup password. I emailed the principal and asked them to flag my parents' names in the system. I wrote, "Unauthorized pickup attempt already occurred," because words like attempt matter when you're building a paper trail. And then I forwarded the school confirmation to Mr. Caldwell as an additional receipt, because if my parents were willing to show up at a school office smiling like saints, I needed every professional adult in this situation to understand the pattern. And then, at 9:43 p.m., the first real punch landed, not from my parents directly, but from someone they sent, because bullies love proxies. My sister Paige texted me, "I can't believe you did this to Mom and Dad." And I stared at her message and thought, isn't it fascinating how the person watching the harm always gets offended by the person stopping it? And I texted back, "I can't believe you watched them do it to my child." And she replied with a long paragraph about respect and family unity, and how I'm bitter and jealous. And it was almost comedic how predictable it was, like she was reading the family handbook. And I didn't answer, because I've learned silence is a scalpel. It cuts where arguing just bruises. The next morning, the certified mail started. And you know something is real when it arrives in a thick envelope with a green sticker and a signature line, because drama is loud but legal notices are quiet, and quiet is scarier. And I didn't even see it first, because of course Aunt Renee sent it like breaking news. A photo of the envelope addressed to my parents with the heading visible through the window, and right there in bold it said, "Notice of trustee removal," and under it another line. That sounded like pure consequences. "Notice of termination of occupancy benefit." And I read those words 3 times because it felt unreal in the best way, like watching a bully slip on a banana peel they threw on the floor for someone else. My phone rang 10 minutes later, and it was my mother, and when I answered, she wasn't sweet anymore. She was panicked, and panic makes people honest. "Marisol, this is insane. This can't be happening. Tell him to stop." And in the background I could hear my father yelling, real yelling, not his controlled dinner party voice. And that sound alone told me everything I needed to know, because men like him don't yell until they've lost leverage. My mother kept talking fast, trying to outrun reality. "We didn't mean it, we were celebrating. You know how people clap, it got carried away." And I let her talk until she ran out of air, and then I said, slowly, "You said it into a microphone," and she whispered, "But we didn't mean she gets nothing." And I said, "You did mean it, because you said it, and you said it with confidence." And she tried a new angle. "We're family." And I said, "You try to take my child from school." And that landed like a slap, because she went quiet for half a beat. And then she said, trembling, "Call Mr. Caldwell. Tell him it was a misunderstanding." And I exhaled, not dramatic, just final. "I can't." And then I added the part that made her breathe in sharply. "And even if I could, I wouldn't. Because here's the truth. When a system finally protects your child, you don't interrupt it to keep adults comfortable." My father grabbed the phone from her. I could hear the movement, the scuffle, and then his voice came through, low and dangerous. "You think you're clever," he said. "You think you've won?" And I said, "No, I think you exposed yourselves." And he hissed, "We'll contest it. We'll tell them she manipulated Grandma." And I felt my pulse rise, but my voice stayed calm. "You should stop talking," I said, "because you're on speaker and I'm recording." and there was a silence, so clean it felt like someone turned the power off in the room, and then I heard my mother whisper, "Stop," like she was trying to hold back a flood with her hands. I hung up, saved the recording, and sat there with my phone in my palm like it weighed 50 pounds, because this is the part nobody tells you about standing up to family, the part after the applause dies, when you're alone in your kitchen, and your hands still shake even though you did the right thing. And then the official email came in, 3 days later, the kind of email written by someone who doesn't care about your family's feelings, only the language on paper, and the subject line said, "Establishment of Subtrusts." And I opened it and read every word like it was oxygen, because it confirmed what Mr. Caldwell hinted at, that the funds would be split into 2 protected subtrusts, 50-50, that the house would be listed for sale because you can't slice a house like cake, and that the occupancy benefit would terminate in 30 days. And I sat there picturing my parents packing boxes in the same living room where they love to host and perform and judge, and I didn't feel joy. I felt relief, because losing their stage meant they couldn't keep using it to hurt children. That evening, Lila walked into the kitchen while I was staring at that email, and she asked, "Mom, are we okay?" And I looked at her, and I realized she wasn't asking about money. She was asking if the world was still predictable, if adults who hurt you always win. And I put my phone down and said, "We're okay." And she whispered, "Does this mean they'll stop?" And I told her the truth. I can't control what they do, but I can control what they get access to. And she frowned. "Access." And I nodded. "Access to you. Access to your school. Access to your peace." And she sat very still for a second. Then she said, "So, we don't have to go there anymore." And I felt tears sting my eyes because I wanted to say that years ago, and I said, "No, we don't." And she let out a breath like she'd been holding it since dinner, and she leaned into me. And in that moment, I realized my parents weren't going to accept consequences quietly, because people like them don't mourn what they did. They mourn what they lost. And the next move they were about to make wasn't going to be an apology. It was going to be a power play, because I saw a new email notification pop up right after I tucked Lila into bed, and it wasn't from Mr. Caldwell this time. It was from a number I hadn't seen in years, and the preview line read, "I have something you need to know about your daughter," and my whole body went cold again, because I knew exactly what kind of game that sentence was trying to start. That message hit my screen like a cold hand on the back of my neck. "I have something you need to know about your daughter." And for a second, I just stared at it while my brain did that awful math it does when you've lived around manipulators long enough, because decent people don't start conversations like that. Decent people don't dangle children like bait. And the sender wasn't a stranger. It was my mother's cousin, Dolores, the family prayer warrior, who somehow always shows up right before a crisis like she's been summoned. And my first thought wasn't fear, it was rage. Because if you are willing to use a kid's name to regain control, you are not family. You are a threat with shared DNA. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't want it, but because I wanted a clean record, and I opened my notes app and wrote the timestamp and took a screenshot of the message, and then I forwarded it to Mr. Caldwell with one line, "New pressure campaign starting," because when people like my parents lose money, they switch to reputation, and when reputation doesn't work, they go after custody. And if you've never seen that side of a family, you're blessed, and I genuinely want to know, if you were in my shoes, would you respond to Dolores at all? Or would you let the silence do the talking? I chose silence for 30 minutes, and it worked like a magnifying glass on an anthill, because Dolores sent another message. "Call me. It's urgent." And then, "Your parents are worried." And that phrase almost made me laugh, because my parents were never worried when Lila asked me if she was stupid. They weren't worried when she cried in the car. They weren't worried when they tried to pick her up from school without permission. But suddenly they're worried now that a trust attorney is pushing paperwork and the house might be gone in 30 days. So I wrote back one sentence, calm and sharp. "Anything you have to say can be said in writing." And Dolores replied instantly, "You're being hostile," which is what controlling people call boundaries. And then she dropped the real weapon. "People are saying you're unfit." And there it was, the pivot from money to motherhood, because they know they can't bully me with shame about my life anymore. but they think they can scare me with my child. I could literally feel my heartbeat in my fingertips as I typed. Who is saying that? And Dolores didn't answer with a name because there was no name, there was just a smear. I heard you yell at her in public, she wrote, and there are concerns about your mental state. And my jaw tightened so hard it hurt because I knew exactly what happened. I raised my voice one time in that school office to stop them from taking my child. And now they were rewriting it as unstable mother. And I sat. They're thinking, so that's the plan. They're going to paint me as the danger to distract from the fact that they were the ones trying to snatch a kid at noon on a Tuesday. Meanwhile, across town, I could picture my mother in her kitchen calling people with that trembling voice performance she saves for strangers. I'm just worried about the child. And my father pacing, not because he cared, but because he hated losing, and my sister Paige texting Brandon, and Brandon acting like a corporate spokesperson. We just want what's best for the family. As if the family is a company and Lila is a line item. And the sickest part is how they recruit the bystanders, because the minute Dolores sent that message, my phone started lighting up with relatives who hadn't asked about Lila's dyslexia in years suddenly asking, "Is everything okay?" And I could smell the gossip through the screen, because in families like this, concern is just curiosity wearing church clothes. I didn't spiral, I moved, because parenting under threat is not about feelings first, it's about steps, and I opened my laptop and wrote an email to Lila's school counselor and principal. Please document any contact attempts from my parents, including phone calls, in-person visits, or third parties, and I asked for a written confirmation. And then I called the non-emergency line and asked what I needed to do if someone attempted an unauthorized pickup again, and I hate that I had to ask that question, but I'd rather be dramatic than be unprepared, because the difference between peace and panic is preparation. Then, right as I was finishing that call, my father texted me directly, "No hello, no apology, just we need to meet." And I stared at that line like it was a trapdoor, because meet is where they regain theater. They want a room, they want tears, they want you to look unreasonable, and I replied, "No in-person meetings. Email only," and he fired back, "You can't dictate terms," and I typed, "Watch me." And I felt my stomach drop because my hands were steady, but my nerves were on fire. The way they get when you know you're doing the right thing and your body still doesn't like the risk. And then the real escalation came, not through Dolores, not through text, but through a knock at my door at 6:18 p.m., the kind of knock that isn't casual. 3 heavy hits, pause, 2 more, and I opened it and saw a woman holding a clipboard, plain clothes, polite smile, and she said, "Ma'am, I'm here for a wellness check," and my entire world narrowed to a single thought. They called someone. My first instinct was to slam the door, but I didn't, because slamming doors looks guilty on paperwork, and I stepped outside so Lila wouldn't hear, and I asked, "Who requested this?" And she said, "A concerned family member." And I almost said my mother's full name with a curse attached, but instead I said, "Okay, you can ask your questions right here," because I wasn't letting a stranger inside my home to satisfy my parents' narrative. She asked if there was food, if Lila was safe, if I'd ever harmed myself or her, if anyone had threatened us, and I answered calmly, and I showed her the school emails, and I showed her the voicemail where my father threatened me, and I showed her the trust notice timeline, and I watched her expression change. Because when you lay out facts in order, the story becomes obvious, and she said quietly, "It sounds like there's a family conflict tied to finances." And I said, "Yes, and they're using a child as leverage." And she nodded slowly, and she asked if she could speak to Lila, and I said yes, but I stayed right there, and Lila came to the doorway in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, and the woman spoke gently, "Hi, sweetie, are you okay?" And Lila looked at me first before answering, and that look broke my heart because it wasn't fear of me. It was the habit of checking if she was safe to speak, and she said, "I'm okay." And then, because my daughter is honest in a way adults forget how to be, she added, "My grandparents are mean," and the woman blinked and asked, "What do you mean?" And Lila said, "They said I'm dumb." And I felt my throat tighten, and the woman's eyes softened in a way that felt like oxygen, because someone neutral finally saw it. After a few more questions, she closed her folder and said, "Based on what I'm seeing, there's no reason for further action." And I asked for her name and her report number, because receipts aren't petty, they're protection. And when she left, I stood in my hallway shaking, not from guilt, but from the sheer audacity of it. The way my parents were willing to put a government worker on my doorstep just to punish me for refusing to let them humiliate my kid on a microphone. I walked into the kitchen, sat down, and stared at the wall. And this is where I need you to be honest with me. If your parents publicly called your child dumb and then tried to erase her inheritance, and then sent a wellness check to your house, would you call that love, or would you call that war? Because in my book, that's war, wrapped in Sunday manners. And while I was sitting there, my sister Paige called, and I answered because I wanted to hear her say it with her own mouth, and she opened with, "Why are you doing this?" Like I was the villain, and I said, "Why did you let them do it to her?" And she snapped, "They were celebrating Sophia." And I said, "By calling a child dumb." And she went quiet for half a second, and then she tried the pivot. "Mom is devastated." And I replied, "Good. Maybe she should sit with the devastation she's been handing out." And Paige said, "You're tearing the family apart." And I said, "No, I'm exposing it." And she started crying, not about Lila, not about what happened, but about consequences. "Dad says you're going to make them homeless." And I laughed once, dry and ugly, because nobody cared about Lila feeling homeless in her own family for 12 years. And I said, "They have 30 days and 2 capable adult children they favored. They'll be fine." And Paige hissed, "Daniela won't help." And that line told me everything, because even the favorite knew this was their fault. And Paige added, "If you would just sign something, we can fix this." And I said, "Fix what?" "Their image." And she whispered, "They're scared." And I said, "So is Lila." And I hung up. And then, later that night, after I tucked Lila in, and she asked me quietly, "Are they going to take me?" And I said, "No, not while I'm breathing." I opened my email and saw a new message from Mr. Caldwell with an attachment, and the subject line was so clean it felt like a blade. Temporary and no-contact advisory and security recommendations, and my hands steadied as I read it, because it confirmed something I already knew in my bones, that this was no longer just family drama. It was a safety issue. And the very last line of his email made my stomach drop again, not from fear this time, but from the scale of what was about to happen. They have retained counsel and requested an emergency hearing to pause the administrative steps. And I stared at that sentence thinking, of course they did, because when people like my parents lose the stage, they run to court, and the next time they saw me, it wouldn't be at a dinner table with a microphone, it would be in front of a judge, and the question wouldn't be whether they were cruel. The question would be whether I was ready to prove it with every receipt I'd
Saved.
The next morning, I didn't wake up like a movie hero with perfect eyeliner and a brave speech ready. I woke up like a single mom with a tight jaw and a to-do list that could break a person. Because once someone threatens your child with court, your life stops being feelings and becomes documentation, timing, and strategy. And I'm telling you right now, if you've never been in that position, you don't understand how loud silence can get inside your house. I made Lila oatmeal the way she likes it, extra cinnamon, little drizzle of honey, and I watched her shoulders while she ate, because kids carry stress in their posture before they ever say a word, and she kept her spoon moving, but her eyes kept flicking to my phone on the counter, like it might explode. I didn't lie to her, I just kept it age honest. I said, "Some adults are making a big mess, and I'm handling it," and she nodded like she wanted to believe me. But belief is hard when your grandparents used a microphone to erase you. After I dropped her at school, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a full minute, engine off, just breathing, because the world expects you to function like normal even when your family is trying to rewrite your reality. And then I called Mr. Caldwell, and he answered on the second ring, calm voice, professional, which I appreciated because panic is contagious, and I could not afford it. He said, They filed a request for an emergency hearing to pause administrative steps. It's not granted yet, but we treat it like it could be. And I said, "What do they want?" And he said, "They want time to move money, time to pressure you, time to build a story." And he paused and added, "And they want you to react emotionally because emotional moms make great villains on paper." That sentence hit me like a slap because it was true, and I asked, "What do I do today?" And he said, "You do 3 things. You tighten your boundaries, you gather evidence, and you stop answering the phone." And then he gave me a checklist so specific it felt like a life raft. School pickup authorizations confirmed, daycare, extracurriculars, pediatrician, any caregiver, any babysitter, and then home security. Cameras, a Ring doorbell if I didn't already have one, and then a written timeline. Dates, times, witnesses, and every text, voicemail, email, and screenshot in a single folder labeled by category, not by emotion, because judges don't rule on vibes. I got off the call, and I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because anger had turned into focus, and focus is what kept my daughter safe. I drove straight to Staples, bought a cheap binder, plastic sleeves, and sticky tabs, and while I was standing in that aisle surrounded by printer ink and people buying paper like it was a normal Thursday, I had this surreal thought. I'm buying office supplies because my parents couldn't resist bullying a child, and I wanted to laugh and throw up at the same time. Back home, I cleared my kitchen table like I was prepping for surgery, laptop open, phone charging, binder in front of me, and I started building the story the way it actually happened. First the pattern, then the event, then the retaliation. I printed the transcript of the anniversary speech from the video because yes, I pulled audio and made it text, word for word, the part where my mother said the trust goes to Sophia, and then said Lila is not included, and I highlighted it in yellow like it was a crime scene because it was. I printed the school call log showing they attempted pickup. I printed the email where I told the school not to release her. I printed the confirmation where the school removed them. I printed the wellness check note number. I printed Dolores's text where she tried to plant the unfit rumor, and I printed my father's voicemail threat, and I transcribed it too. Because a judge won't sit there and listen to a 2-minute voicemail when you can show it in black and white. And as I did this, I kept thinking about how families like mine always rely on fog. They rely on confusion, on I didn't mean it, on you're sensitive, on that never happened. And the reason they use fog is because fog keeps bystanders comfortable, and the second you put it on paper, it stops being family drama and becomes a pattern of behavior that looks exactly like what it is. Emotional abuse plus financial control plus intimidation. Around noon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and for a split second my stomach dropped, but I let it go to voicemail because I'm done being baited. And then I checked the voicemail, and it was a receptionist from a law office. Polite voice. "We represent Mr. and Mrs. Friedman. Please call us back regarding a family matter." And I felt my pulse rise because they were doing the thing, the big adult intimidation move. We hired counsel, like it magically cleans the blood off their hands. 10 minutes later, an email came in, subject line, "Request for cooperation," and it was written in that cold, syrupy tone that tries to sound reasonable while threatening you. And it said my parents were concerned about Lila's well-being, and they wanted grandparent visitation. And they wanted a pause on trust restructuring until family reconciliation could occur. And then it ended with a line that made my skin crawl. "We hope to avoid public escalation," which is rich, because they started public escalation with a microphone. I forwarded it to Mr. Caldwell, and I did not respond. And then I did something that felt small but mattered. I texted my friend Nia, the one who has watched me get swallowed by this family for years, and I said, "If anything happens, you are my witness." And she replied, "Say less, I'm pulling up." And an hour later, she came over with coffee and sat with me at the table like a quiet guard dog, reading the documents, shaking her head, and she said, "They're not scared of losing you, they're scared of losing control." And I said, "Exactly." And then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "You know they're going to try to flip Sophia against Lila too." And my chest tightened because she was right, because my parents don't just hurt people directly, they recruit children to carry the knives. And then the universe proved her right, because at 2:07 p.m., I got a message from Daniela, long paragraph, lots of words, zero accountability. She said I had embarrassed the family, that I was poisoning Lila, that Lila was too sensitive, and then the line that made my hands go cold. Sophia feels unsafe around you now. And I stared at that like it was a masterclass in manipulation, because of course, the golden child suddenly feels unsafe the moment fairness shows up, and I could practically hear my mother coaching her. Tell them you're scared. It plays well, and I wanted to respond. I wanted to rip her apart sentence by sentence, but Nia put her hand over my phone and said, "Don't feed it." And she was right, because my job wasn't to win a text argument. My job was to protect my kid and hold my ground. That evening, when I picked Lila up from school, she walked fast to the car like she'd been practicing bravery, and once the doors shut, she finally exhaled and asked, "Did they come?" And I said, "No, not today." And she nodded. Then she stared out the window and said, "Mom, why do they like Sophia more?" And I didn't give her a cheap answer. I didn't say they love you too, because that would be lying. I said, some adults confuse control with love, and Sophia fits their script, and you don't. And that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means their love has conditions. And she was quiet, and then she whispered, "Is there something wrong with me?" And I pulled over again, because that question is a knife, and I turned to her and said, "No. There's something wrong with adults who humiliate kids and call it honesty." And I watched her eyes fill, but she didn't cry. She just nodded like she was storing the truth in a new place inside her. That night, I let her pick dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup. And we watched a silly show and laughed at the same joke twice, because laughter is how kids test if the world is still safe. And when she finally went to bed, I went back to the kitchen table and kept building the binder, and around 11:40 p.m. Mr. Caldwell emailed again, one sentence, "Hearing scheduled. Temporary pause, request will be argued." And my stomach dropped, and then rose, because this was it, the moment where my parents would try to stand in front of a stranger in a robe and pretend they were loving grandparents, and I would have to prove they were the same people who cheered while a child got erased. I stared at the screen, and I thought about my mother's bright fake smile, my father's calm threats, Daniela's curated outrage, and then I looked down at the pages in my binder and realized something that made me both sick and relieved. They can lie out loud, but they can't outlie a timeline, they can't outperform video, and they can't rewrite a microphone moment that lives forever. I closed the laptop and stood in the dark kitchen, and I had one of those neurotic thoughts you only admit to yourself. The thought that says, what if I'm about to become the villain in their story for the rest of my life? And then I answered my own thought out loud. Good. Because if being the villain means my daughter is safe and protected, then let them boo. I can live with it. And right as I was about to go to bed, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number, just one line. "If you show up to court, you'll regret it." And I stared at it, heart thumping, because now it wasn't just manipulation, it was intimidation, and I knew exactly what I had to do next, and it wasn't pretty, and it wasn't polite, but it was necessary, because the moment someone threatens you to stay quiet, the only safe move is to make it impossible for them to hide. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened after that threat text, because this is the part families like mine never expect. They expect you to fold, to get scared, to start negotiating your child's dignity like it's a coupon, and I didn't. I did the opposite. I made it official. First thing, I screenshot the message. I exported the full conversation thread so it showed the number and timestamp, and then I emailed it to Mr. Caldwell and my own attorney, because yes, the second your parents start threatening you, you stop playing family and you start playing evidence. And then I did one more thing that felt petty until I remembered my kid's face at that tablecloth. I turned on airplane mode, restarted my phone, turned airplane mode off, and checked that the message still existed in the carrier log, because I've learned the hard way that people who live by manipulation also love disappearing proof. By 7:10 a.m. the next morning, I was dressed for court. Not dressed cute, dressed serious, hair pulled back, flat shoes, no jewelry that could be grabbed, because when your life becomes conflict, you stop dressing for photos and you dress for function. Lila was still asleep when I left her a note on the kitchen counter. Simple words: "I love you, I'll be back after grown-up paperwork. You're safe." And I hated that I had to write notes like that, but I also knew kids need anchors when adults are being storms. Nia rode with me because she insisted, and honestly, I needed the presence of someone who saw me as a person, not a problem. The courthouse smelled like old carpet and coffee breath, and the hallway outside the courtroom was full of people in different versions of fear, some angry, some shaking, some performing calm. And then I saw my parents, and it was like watching two actors step into a role they've practiced for decades. My mother had on her church smile, the one that says I'm sweet, I'm harmless, I'm a victim, and my father stood beside her with that polished stillness, like he was a businessman waiting for a meeting, not a man who threatened his daughter by text the night before. Daniela was there too, of course, because she never misses a chance to be seen doing the right thing, and she had Sophia with her, which made my stomach twist, because bringing a child to a courtroom is a choice, and it's a cruel one when the child is there to be a prop. Sophia sat on a bench swinging her feet like she was waiting for a school assembly, and then she spotted me, and her eyes did that quick-skin kids do when they're checking who has power, and I saw it, that tiny adultness they force onto her. The way she was already trained to pick sides. My mother started walking toward me, and I stepped back before she even reached me. Not dramatic, just firm, because I'm done giving her access to my space. And she froze for a second, like she couldn't believe I denied her the performance. "Maya," she said softly, "sweetheart, we don't have to do this like enemies." And I looked her straight in the face and said, "You chose enemies when you chose a microphone." And her smile stiffened, and my father leaned in with that low voice meant to sound reasonable to strangers. "Let's be adults. This is getting out of hand." And I said, "It got out of hand when you tried to take my child from school." And his nostrils flared, because nothing makes controlling men angrier than a woman naming what they did without apologizing for it. We went into the courtroom, and the judge came in, and everything got quiet in that heavy way where your heart feels like it's pressing against your ribs. My parents' attorney started first, and he did exactly what I knew he would do. He painted them as loving grandparents. He said they were concerned about a child with learning challenges. He said they feared I was isolating Lila. He said the trust restructuring was premature and emotionally driven. And he tried to make it sound like I was an unstable single mom on a revenge mission instead of a mother protecting her kid from public humiliation and private intimidation. And here's where I want you to pay attention, because if you're watching this and you've ever dealt with a toxic family, this is the playbook. They don't argue the truth. They argue the framing. They don't say, "We didn't do it." They say, "She's overreacting." Because if they can make you look irrational, they can keep their image clean even with blood on their hands. My father even did this little sigh at one point like he was burdened by my emotions, and I wanted to laugh because this man threatened me at midnight, and now he was playing wounded grandpa. Then my attorney stood, and we didn't start with feelings, we started with facts. We submitted the video transcript, we submitted the voicemail threats. We submitted the school pickup attempt with the school's written confirmation, and we submitted the new threat text from the unknown number. And then we did something that made my mother's eyes widen. We asked the judge to listen to the actual audio clip from the anniversary. Because when people hear cruelty with their own ears, it hits different than reading it on paper. The judge listened, the room listened, and my mother's voice filled the courtroom saying the trust goes to Sophia, and then that Lila is not included. And it sounded even uglier in that sterile room than it did in the banquet hall, because now it wasn't wrapped in champagne and applause. It was exposed under fluorescent lights, naked and mean. And you could feel the shift. You could feel it like air pressure changing, because even if a judge has heard everything, they still recognize a moment when a child was intentionally excluded for entertainment. The judge paused the audio and looked up and asked one question that hit my parents like a slap. Why was this said publicly? And my mother tried to wiggle. She said it was a joke, a misunderstanding, a celebratory moment, and the judge's face didn't move. And then my father opened his mouth to help, and my attorney cut in and asked, "A joke for who?" And there was no clean answer, because the joke's punchline was my child. Now let me stop you right here and ask you something, because I want you in this with me. Where are you watching from right now? What city, what state, and what time is it for you? Because I swear the people who understand this story the deepest are the ones who've lived through family politics at a table where you were treated like the extra chair, and I want to know I'm not telling this into a void. Back to that courtroom, because this is where it got real. The judge asked my parents directly if they attempted to pick Lila up from school without my consent, and my mother said, "We were listed as emergency contacts." Like that excused it, and the judge said, "Were you asked to go?" And my mother hesitated, and that hesitation was loud, because it told the truth. And then my father got sharp and said, "We're family." And the judge replied, "Family is not a legal permission slip." And I felt something inside me unclench for the first time in weeks. Then my attorney introduced the trust attorney's affidavit, Mr. Caldwell's statement confirming the clause trigger and confirming the administrative process. And when the judge asked whether my parents had been properly notified, their attorney said yes. And then we presented the certified letter photo and the email confirmation. And the judge nodded like a person stacking blocks in their head, building a structure that could not be knocked down by tears. My mother started crying at that point. Not soft crying, staged crying, the kind that is timed, and she said, "We're going to lose our home." And I wanted to scream, because imagine crying about losing a house after you tried to erase a child, but I stayed still, because one thing I've learned is toxic people love pulling you into spectacle, and I refused to give her that. The judge ruled on the emergency request right there. He denied the pause. He said the trust administrative steps were to proceed. He said any grandparent contact would be considered later only if it was in the child's best interest, and only with clear boundaries. And he warned my parents about further intimidation or surprise contact attempts at school, and when he said the words best interest, my mother flinched, because she realized this room wasn't measuring who looked nicest, it was measuring who acted safest. Outside the courtroom, my father's mask came off so fast it was almost comical. He hissed, "You think you won?" And I said, "This was never about winning, it was about stopping you." And Daniela stepped in like she always does when she wants control back. She said, "You're destroying the family." And I looked at her and said, "You watched them destroy a child and you clapped." And she went quiet, because the truth is a rude guest. It shows up and ruins their script. Sophia started crying then, real crying, confused crying, because she was caught between adults who trained her to compete and a reality where competition had consequences. And I felt bad for her, I did, because kids are mirrors, they reflect what adults teach them. My mother tried one last move. She leaned toward me and whispered, "Tell me what you want, money, apologies, what?" And I said, "I want you away from my daughter." And her eyes hardened for a split second before the smile tried to come back, and that split second told me everything I needed to know. Nia and I got to the car, and I sat there shaking, not because I regretted anything, but because adrenaline has to exit your body somehow. And then my phone buzzed with a new email from Mr. Caldwell, subject line, "Formal implementation begins." And inside was the timeline, the sale listing date, the trustee removal confirmation, and the subtrust structure details, and right under that, another line that made my stomach drop again. "Expect contact attempts and narrative escalation, prepare." Accordingly, and as if the universe wanted to prove him right immediately, Lila's school called again. But this time it wasn't a pickup attempt, it was worse. It was a wellness check request filed by an anonymous party claiming I was emotionally unstable and withholding family, and I gripped the steering wheel and stared out at the parking lot and realized the fight had just changed shape, because when you stop toxic people from taking your child with love, they try to take your child with systems, and now I had to move faster than their lies without becoming the monster they wanted to paint. The call from the school about that wellness check request felt like somebody dumped ice water down my spine because it wasn't just family drama anymore, it was a strategy, and strategies get kids hurt. I said, "Do not discuss my child with anyone without me present, and please document who called and what they asked for." And then I drove to the school with my jaw clenched so hard my molars ached. When I walked into the office, my mother was already there, smiling like a lady in a toothpaste commercial, while my dad stood beside her with that stiff posture he uses when he's about to pretend he's the victim. And there was my daughter, Lila, sitting in a plastic chair with her backpack on her lap, small and tense and trying to make herself take up less space, like she'd learned that shrinking is safer. My mom chirped, "There she is. We were just worried." And my dad cut in, "We're her grandparents. We have rights." I looked straight at the receptionist and said, "Remove them from her file right now, and put a note that they are not authorized for pickup, not authorized for information, not authorized for contact." My mom's smile cracked. "Maya, don't do this. You're embarrassing us." And I thought, here we go, because in their world, the worst crime isn't cruelty, it's being witnessed. I turned to my parents and kept my voice flat. "You tried to corner my child at school the day after you humiliated her into a microphone. You don't get access to her.
Not now.
Not ever.
Leave."
My dad leaned closer, like intimidation still worked on me. "You're making this worse." And I said, "No, you made it worse when you called her the dumb one and announced she gets nothing. You chose a microphone. I'm choosing protection." The receptionist's fingers moved fast on the keyboard. My mother hissed, "We weren't going to hurt her." And I stared at her and said, "You already did." Then I crouched beside Lila, smoothed her hair back, and whispered, "You're not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. Adults made bad choices, and I'm fixing it." She nodded like she didn't fully believe me yet, but she wanted to. On the drive home, she asked, "Mom, did I ruin their night?" And I laughed once, the kind of laugh that comes out dry because you refuse to cry in front of your kid. "Honey, they ruined their own night. They've been practicing for years." She looked out the window and said quietly, "I don't want them to hate me." And that sentence punched me in the chest because it was proof of how fast a child turns other people's ugliness into self-blame. I pulled into our driveway, made hot chocolate like it was a ritual, and while she stirred the mug with a spoon, she asked, "What does beneficiary mean?" And I said, "It means Grandma loved you enough to write protection into paper." Then she whispered, "Because I'm dumb," and I set the mug down, got eye level with her, and said, slow and clear, "You are not dumb. You have dyslexia. Your brain takes a different path. Different path doesn't mean you don't get to arrive." She blinked hard, and I could tell she was trying not to cry because in our family, tears always got punished or performed for. That night, after I tucked her in, I sat at the kitchen table, pulled up the anniversary video, and watched it like a surgeon watching a scan. I didn't watch it to torture myself. I watched it to capture exact timestamps, exact words, and exact faces. My mom's bright laugh. My dad's smug pause. Daniela's proud hand on her daughter's shoulder. The moment the room cheered like they were applauding a child being erased. Then I emailed the clip to Mr. Caldwell with one line. Trigger occurred. Recorded. At 6:12 a.m., my inbox pinged with the kind of email that looks boring until it changes your life. Confirmation of notice receipt. The triggering event occurred on record. Administrative steps will begin today. Administrative steps. 2 words that sound harmless until you realize they're the legal version of you touched the hot stove and now you're going to learn what burns. My dad called at 7:03 a.m. and left a voicemail that started calm, the way his voice always gets when he's trying to sound reasonable for the record. "Maya, stop whatever you think you're doing. This is a misunderstanding." Then the calm snapped into threat. "If you don't fix this, you will regret it." I saved it, not because I'm petty, because I'm a mom, and moms who survive learn to keep receipts. Daniela texted a novel about loyalty, respect, and mom and dad did so much for you. And I replied with one sentence, "You watch them do it to my child." And that's where her words died, because there's no cute comeback to that. That afternoon, the escalation came in a new outfit, official mail, certified envelope, bright sticker, signatures, the kind of thing you can't gaslight away. Aunt Renee, yes, the same aunt who laughs at the wrong times, texted me a photo of it like it was celebrity gossip. Notice of trustee removal. Elena Family Trust. Under it, notice of termination of occupancy benefit, which is fancy language for you don't get to live in the house you've been using like a throne. My phone rang 10 minutes later. My mother was sobbing so hard she could barely form words. "Maya, this is insane. This can't be happening." And in the background I heard my father yelling, not his polished anger, real panic, the sound of a man realizing his favorite weapon has been taken out of his hand. She begged, "Call Mr. Caldwell, make him stop." And I said, "I can't." And then I added the part that mattered. "And even if I could, I wouldn't." She snapped, "You're punishing us." And I said, "I'm protecting her." Then my dad shouted in the background, "She planned this, she's bitter." And my mom whispered, "Stop," like she was trying to smother a fire with her bare hands, and then she tried a new angle. "We'll contest it. We'll tell them grandma wasn't well." And that's when I said, quietly, "Then you should probably stop talking, because you're on speaker and I'm recording." Silence. A hard, choking silence. Then the sound of something scraping like a chair moved too fast. I hung up and stared at the wall for a long minute because I wasn't celebrating. I was steady. There's a difference. 3 days later, the next email arrived. Establishment of subtrusts. Beneficiary allocation confirmed. I opened it with my heart in my throat. 2 subtrusts were being created. One for Lila, one for Sophia, 50-50. The $280,000 split into protected accounts. And the house, because you can't split a house like a cupcake, was to be listed, sold, and the proceeds divided equally into those 2 subtrusts. Timeline included. Vacate within 30 days. 30 days. My parents' entire identity was built around that house. It wasn't a home to them, it was a stage. A proof of status museum where they displayed their legacy like trophies and used inheritance like a leash. And now the stage lights were shutting off because they couldn't resist humiliating a child into a microphone. That night, Lila walked into the kitchen in her socks, hair messy from sleep, and she asked, "Mom, are we okay?" I put my hand on her cheek and said, "We're okay. We're safe." She nodded, then asked the question that tells you exactly how kids think. "Does that mean they'll stop?" And I told her the truth, because lies don't heal anything. I can't control what they do. I can control what they get access to. Access. That word became my new religion. I updated the school contacts, the doctor's office, the after-school program, every permission list, every emergency contact. Then I sent my parents one text. I do not contact Lila without me.
Ever.
My dad replied instantly, "You can't keep her from us." And I typed back, "Watch me." Within 24 hours, that anniversary clip detonated through the family like a firework in a dry forest. Not because I posted it. I didn't. I had a child to protect, not a revenge brand to build. But family group chats don't need permission. Someone forwarded it. Someone added captions. Someone zoomed in on my mother's face when she said, "Lila is not included." My parents tried the usual cleanup routine. Taken out of context, it was a joke. We never said that. She was emotional. They were celebrating. None of it stuck because this time their words weren't floating in the air. They were sitting in everyone's camera roll. 3 months later, the house sold for $1.2 million. After fees and closing costs, the proceeds went straight into the 2 subtrusts exactly as written.
Not a penny went to my parents.
No cushion. No temporary help. No, just until we get back on our feet. Nothing. They lost the house, lost trustee control, lost the ability to dangle inheritance like bait, and the most brutal part is they lost it by their own mouth. They used to act like they were kings because they held the keys. Turns out they were just tenants with an ego. Daniela didn't rescue them either, which honestly was the funniest twist of all, in a dark way. They trained her to treat legacy like a prize and love like a contract, and then she applied that training to them the minute they became inconvenient. She protected Sophia's half like it was Fort Knox, told my parents they were the ones who triggered the clause, and went right back to her life, which was so on brand it almost made me laugh out loud. My parents downsized into a small rental across town. Not a tragic movie scene, just real life, the kind where nobody cares who you used to be. No grand dining room. No anniversary mic. No audience. Just 2 people finally forced to sit with themselves. And here's the part one want you to weigh in on, because I know a lot of you watching are grandparents, parents, aunties, uncles, the elders who've seen family politics up close. Did I go too far by letting the trust hit them this hard, or not far enough by not pressing charges for the school stunt? And what would you have done if someone tried to label your child the dumb one in public and then erase her financially? Drop it in the comments and tell me where you're watching from, because I'm genuinely curious how different parts of the country handle family loyalty when loyalty is being used like a weapon. I'll tell you what happened to Lila next too, because the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was watching her stop apologizing for her brain, watching her read out loud at 16 with that slow, steady confidence like she owned every word, and watching her realize that adults who mock kids aren't powerful, they're just loud. The moral lesson is simple, and it's not pretty. If somebody uses inheritance to control you, they don't love you. They're renting your obedience, and rent always comes due. The second lesson is even sharper. When you finally set a boundary, the people who benefited from your silence will call it cruelty, and that's how you know the boundary was necessary. And here's the part nobody expects. The day the house officially closed, my dad didn't call to apologize. He called to ask for help like I was his emergency fund. I'll tell you what I said and what it cost us in the next story. You can learn from it.